Bueno, vamos a clausurar ya el simposio con una conferencia que va a ser impartida en... Sí, va a ser impartida por el profesor Carlos Ornelas de México, al cual nos hemos referido en estos 2 días. Va a ser impartida en nuestra lengua materna, el español. Bueno, no hace falta decir algo que es obvio. La gran aportación de España y su cultura al mundo,
fact that Spain has provided something relevant to the culture and the world, which is language, Spanish language. We are relevant because of language,
por el dominio de la lengua, y somos
because of
importantes
the
por la América hispana.
Spanish American language as well, all the Americas that speak Spanish.
Y
This is
tenemos
the
que
big
sentirnos orgullosos.
part that Spain has provided to the world, and we have to be
Podemos
proud
ser
of
más
that.
significados en el mundo,
We could be
por la
more
gran
significant in
aportación
the
de nuestra
world
lengua.
thanks to the
Pero claro,
language.
Hay,
But of
ahora se
course,
habla de las superpoderes,
we have to speak about the superpowers,
se hablan
we
de
speak
los
about
super,
the
que,
super things
a veces pues no interesa que
that
seamos
sometimes
tan
we're
fuertes
not
en
interested
este
in
mundo
being
tan
so strong
competitivo.
in this competitive world.
Pero
But
aquí tenemos a una persona
we have
que
somebody
representa muy
here
bien
who represents very well
lo que es un académico
the role of the academic,
hispano
a Spanish
de
academic
nuestra
person
cultura, que tiene una tradición muy brillante.
with a brilliant
Yo lo conocía de
career.
nombre precisamente por el tema
I
que
knew
nos ocupa esta
his
tarde.
name because of the
Yo
topic
descubrí
that
su
we're dealing
nombre
with today.
hace unos
I
años
found
cuando
out
supe que había un
that
artículo,
he
lo encontré, sobre
was relevant to the field
la
because of a paper
experiencia de las
on
cooperativas
the
de
experience of
Mondragón
cooperatives in
y de la
Mondragón
Escuela Profesional Politécnica de
and
Mondragón,
the
que es
Professional
hoy
Polytechnic
una
School in
universidad
Mondragón in the Basque Country,
apoyada por el gobierno vasco.
supported by the Basque government
Y
today.
entonces ahí le seguí la
And
pista, yo dejé
I
este tema
lost
y
track of
cuando
him,
retomamos
but
el
when
tema,
we
ver, digo,
came
bueno,
back to it,
y ya
I said, why not?
el
Why
descubrimiento
shan't
se
we
ha transformado en un conocimiento ya personal
collaborate? And we have
muy
collaborated. And
importante. Y para mí, al final de
it
mi
is very
carrera
important at the
académica,
end
cuando
of
ya me
my
voy a ir,
career, when I'm about to leave,
me encuentro con México, que con el que he tenido encuentros y ha estado varias veces,
I
con un
found
colega
Mexico, and I've
que
been there
conocía
several
sí,
times
pero
with a
que no lo
colleague
conocía
that I
personalmente
had
y
met
que en
before,
realidad no había
but
leído
that I had
su
never
producción. En cambio, sí que
interacted
había
with.
tenido conocimiento con otros colegas,
But I had met
de
other
los cuales ya
colleagues
no tengo contacto.
with whom I have no contact
Y
anymore.
ahora, en realidad, en mis últimos años, con quien voy a tener contacto es con Carlos
And
Ornelas.
in my last few years
Carlos
as an
Ornelas,
academic,
nació en Durango.
expert, I'm going to have
Durango es
contact with him.
Vizcaya,
He was born in
la
Durango,
Vizcaya
in
de México.
Vizcaya,
Tiene que ver con el País Vasco,
Mexico.
porque
It has to
sale
do with
Durango,
the Basque
sabemos
Country
dónde está.
because Durango, we know where it is.
Realmente la historia de esta tesis que hizo él en 1900,
The history
defendida
of
nada menos que en la
the
Universidad de
PhD
Stanford,
thesis that he
sobre las
presented in the
cooperativas
University of
y la
Stanford
escolarización
on
en
cooperatives
Mondragón
and
a
scholarization in
través
Mondragón.
de esa experiencia, el
Through
caso
this
de Mondragón,
experience, the case of Mondragón,
es tremendamente provechosa para
is
entender
very
cómo
important to
en una
understand
parte de España, que es el
how
País
in a
Vasco,
part of Spain, in the Basque Country,
se produce un movimiento tremendamente dinámico.
there's a very dynamic
Carlos
movement.
Ornelas me ha estado en estos
Carlos
días
Ornelas
explicando, y ya lo he
has
dicho,
explained
cómo encontró este tema,
how he found
cómo
this topic,
lo elaboró,
how he
cómo se
developed it,
involucró. Es tan
how he
interesante
became
que
committed and
uno de los
involved.
materiales que os
It's so
vamos a
interesting
mandar
that one of the materials
es
that we're
ese
going to
artículo del
send
prospect,
is this
que
prospect
después
article
se amplió y apareció en otra publicación española, de la
that
cual no voy a
was
hablar ahora,
then
y después
published
hay
in
otras
Spain,
publicaciones
and there
donde
are other
aparece.
publications where this can be read.
La tesis doctoral
The PhD thesis
sale de su implicación
comes from the implication
con dos
and involvement
importantísimos
with two
catedráticos de la
important
Universidad de
full professors
Stanford
from
relacionados con la
Stanford
sociología y la
related
educación,
to sociology
que
and
es
education.
Martin Carnoy.
Martin
De hecho,
Carnoy.
iba a ser Martin Carnoy el que le iba a dirigir
Martin
la
Carnoy
tesis
was the
doctoral,
one
pero
to
tenía un sabático y entonces
devote
a Carlos que fuera su amigo,
to his thesis to be the supervisor,
y
but
estrecho colaborador,
it was finally
Henry Levin,
Henry
que fuera
Levin,
al final su director.
who was the
En ambos casos,
PhD supervisor.
insistieron que tenía que ser sobre
In both
Mondragón,
cases,
que
it
tenía
had
que
to be
ir
about
a
Mondragón,
tenía
he
que
had to go
vivir
to
aquella
Mondragón, he had to live the
experiencia,
experience,
etcétera.
etc.
Y después tuvo otra persona que yo no sabía, que lo apoyó bastante.
And then he also was supported by another person who was the director of the program, a German person that has come back to Germany, Hans Weiler, that I've met
y que yo aprecié y
and
que a
that
través
I
mío se han publicado varios estudios.
published things with.
Es decir, estamos, en mi caso, con tres personas que yo aprecio muchísimo.
So
y
we're speaking about three people
una
that
persona que las ha tenido de mentores.
I'm very particularly fond of.
Carlos redactó su tesis.
Carlos drafted his PhD.
En 1980 la
In
defiende.
1980 was finished.
Se publican los estudios y después ya
The studies were
comienza
published
una
and then
muy
he starts a
brillante
very
carrera
brilliant career
como académico en México,
as an academic
y
in
publicando
Mexico,
libros importantísimos.
publishing very important books.
Y hay uno
And
concretamente
there's one
del cual se han hecho 32.000 ejemplares
that has
en una editorial
published
muy importante
32,000
para todos los que
books
somos
of it.
de cultura hispana, que es Fondo de Cultura Económica, donde la emigración española,
This was published
republicana,
in Fondo de
protegida por el
Cultura
presidente
Económica.
Cárdenas de México, continuó una labor muy importante.
President Cárdenas in
en
Mexico started
cuando
a
nuestro
strong
país ya
work
pasaba
in
a
Mexico
ser un
when
estado
Spain
autoritario.
became an
El libro
authoritarian
se llama,
regime.
concretamente el sistema educativo
It is called the
mexicano, la
Mexican
transición
educational
de
system,
fin
the
de siglo.
transition
Después ha
at
publicado
the end
más
of the
libros
century.
muy importantes, no
Then
hace
he has
falta que lo
published other
repita
books,
ahora,
very important
y
ones,
también en inglés.
also in English.
Ahora concretamente en mi colaboración con Carlos
My
se ha
collaboration
visto
with Carlos
enriquecida porque
has
hay
been
una
enriched
colección
because there's a
de Brill,
collection
esta
of Brill,
prestigiosa editorial
this
primera
important
en el mundo de ciencias sociales
publishing
de
house,
Holanda,
number one in
que
social
tiene
sciences
una
in
serie
the Netherlands,
dedicada en
that
inglés
has a series devoted
al
in
mundo,
English to the
hispano,
Hispanic world.
no solo al mundo de América, sino de Portugal y de
Not only in
España.
America, but also in Portugal and Spain.
Ya se ha publicado un libro muy importante y hay otro en camino.
A very important
sobre
book has been
todo lo que
published, and there's
significa
another one
Freire,
coming.
y en inglés, con estudios que seguro van a ser provechosos. Bien, no voy a quitarle más tiempo.
I'm not going
Carlos,
to take
y
any further
aquí
time
está
from Carlos's
su conferencia
keynote speech
magistral
that is
de
going to be
clausura.
delivered to close this
Y como lo
symposium.
dicho, vamos a estar en contacto con él.
So let's be in touch with
Vais a
him.
tener más material.
You will
para
have more
leer,
material to read,
y cualquier cuestión, sencillamente poneros en contacto con
and if you want
nosotros o
to
también con él,
deal
porque hay
with
aquí
him,
un correo
get in touch with him or with us.
electrónico, y yo
We
estoy
have
seguro que él estará gustoso
an email, and he'll be
de
delighted to
contestar.
answer.
Muchas gracias, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos.
Muchas gracias, Miguel.
Thank you,
Muy
Miguel.
amable por la
You're very
invitación.
kind
Muchas gracias
to invite
también
me,
por traerme
and thank you
a este
for
tema
bringing
de
me to this
educación
topic
media
of
después de 40 años.
middle of,
fue mi tesis de
of,
doctorado. tuve estos
middle
mentores que ya
education,
mis amigos ahora también.
because I have left
Que ya
the topic for
mencionó-
some
que ya
time, and
mencionó
I'm
Miguel,
back
sobre
to it
todo
now,
Martin.
thanks to
Martin
you.
fue realmente
Especially Martin. Martin
quien
was
me guió mucho.
the person who
Ya en
gave
la
me a
etapa
lot,
final fue Henry, o
and
Hank,
then
como
Henry,
decimos,
o Hank.
Amistosamente. Y trabajé en un proyecto
and
de
I worked
ellos.
in a project
El
that they had.
proyecto era Economic Democracy.
It was
in
economic
Europe.
democracy in Europe.
Era, y estaban buscando experiencias
They were looking for
donde
experiences
los trabajadores
where workers
tuvieran que ver
would
con
have
la producción,
something
pero
to do with
también con la
production, but
dirección de
also
las
with
empresas.
the management of the
Entonces, el
companies.
caso de las cooperativas de
The
Mondragón
case of
y
the
Arrasate
cooperatives
era,
in Mondragón and
peculiar.
Arrasate
Entonces,
was
Hank
very
me dice,
specific.
que si
Hank
yo trabajo
said
con él va a
that
apoyar
if
para
I
la tesis,
worked with
me
him,
va a dar
he
una beca
would
para venir
support
a
me.
Mondragón, y
I
no
would be
solamente yo,
given a
traer mi
grant,
familia, mi esposa, mis hijos. Y pasé 6 meses
and
de
I spent
1978
6 months
en
from
Mondragón, y me di
1978 1978 in Mondragón.
de esta escuela antes de,
I
mucho
realized
antes de que fuera
the relevance of
universidad.
this school
Era-
before it
pero
was
ya había
a
ascendido
university,
a escuela
and it had
politécnica.
become
Ya no era nada más la escuela de
a polytechnic
formación
school. It was
profesional, ya había
not
subido a
anymore
politécnica,
the vocational
donde
training
los
school, but it was Polytechnic
trabajadores
University.
son los dueños de las empresas.
Workers
Y la
are the
escuela
owners of the
era
companies, and the
también
school was
cooperativa
also
donde
a
los maestros
cooperative where
eran parte, eran sus
teachers
propios
were
patrones, eran los dueños.
the
Y lo más
owners.
importante, los estudiantes de la escuela
And what's more
hacían
important, the
prácticas, era la
students
educación
were
dual,
doing
como las conocemos
internships
hoy, hacían prácticas en las fábricas,
in those
en
factories,
Ulgor, en Fagor, en todas las
in
empresas
Fagor,
corporativas
in
grandes
big
donde
companies
estaban
that
fabricando
were there.
refrigeradores,
They were
estufas,
building
bicicletas,
fridges,
acero,
bicycles,
tuvieron su acería,
there
un
were
montón de cosas.
steel
Y luego los
factories, etc.
estudiantes hacen
And
su propia cooperativa.
then the
Alecop,
students have
donde
their
ellos
own
eran
cooperative,
los
Alecop.
propietarios, cooperativas,
They were
y
the
eran
owners,
trabajadores.
and they were also
Y ahí la
workers.
combinación del estudio en la escuela con el trabajo productivo y con actividades de deportes.
So that was the combination of
frontón, que, pues,
the
les
study,
encanta
the work,
los-
and also sports.
a los escaldunes, era parte de la cultura. Bueno, ahí
Sports was
trabajé
also part of the culture.
6 meses, hice amigos, me recogí bastante información.
I was there for 6
hice,
months. I
pruebas empíricas que
became
era lo que
friends with
exigían
many
en aquel
people there,
entonces,
and I
con
gathered
una,
the evidence that was
con
needed.
un estudio de caso
It was
de
a case
control,
study,
que era
a
otra escuela
control case study
profesional en
for
Eibar,
another
escuela de
professional
armería, muy
school
famosa,
in
la escuela de
Eibar,
armería de Eibar.
the
Y
Armed School of in
no encontré grandes
Eibar.
diferencias en términos
I
de
found no
valores
big
de
differences
cultura,
in as much as
porque la cultura vasca era
values,
muy
culture,
fuerte,
because
y más en ese
Basque culture
tiempo
was
donde
very
estaba
strong then,
recuperándose,
and at that time we
la
were
lengua
recovering
vasca,
the language,
el
the
euskara,
Basque
que
language,
había estado
Euskara,
prohibido durante los
had
años del
been
franquismo.
forbidden during the
Esa
times
es
of Franco.
está la tesis, hubo varios productos.
So we had the PhD
artículos
thesis,
en
we had
inglés,
articles
español,
in
francés,
English,
y
French,
uno fue
Spanish,
traducido
etc.
también
And one was
del
translated
inglés al español.
from English into Spanish.
Bien, pero ¿qué?
Well,
Que yo soy obediente.
I'm very
Y
obedient.
cuando Miguel me invitó, quería que
So
viniera
when
a hablar
Miguel invited
del
me, he
modelo
wanted me to
mexicano de
speak about the
formación
Mexican
dual.
model of
Ya el
dual training.
argumento lo construí yo, pero le obedecí y también
So,
le obedecí porque me dijo que hablara poquito, no mucho, sobre mi trabajo.
I
en
will
Mondragón.
do it, and I was told to speak not a lot, but a little bit about Mondragón.
Bien, estoy aquí en el patio de mi casa con mi mascota.
This
Era
is
todavía
my
un
pet.
pequeño ejemplar.
At
cuando
that time
me
it
tomé
was
esta
a
foto.
small
Y es una mentira.
tiger. No,
es
this
en
is
mi
a lie.
casa, es en un refugio en Tailandia.
This is in Thailand.
Pero, y no tiene nada que ver con esta charla, pero me encanta.
It has nothing to do with this talk, but I like to boast that I have
y
no
tampoco a las
fear
tigres.
of
Así es que serán
tigers
bienvenidas
or
con los
criticisms.
comentarios. Y
So you can
advierto,
criticize me,
si se van,
and I warn you,
alguien se va, le suelto al tigre.
if anybody's leaving, I will release the tiger.
Tengo dos preguntas
I
básicas.
have two questions.
Bueno, tres. Dos preguntas.
Two questions, maybe.
¿Cómo
Yeah.
puede interpretarse la
How can we
transferencia y
interpret
adaptación
the
de la
transfer
formación dual a
and
México? Me
adaptation
refiero
of
a la influencia de los
the influence
países de habla
of
germana
of Mexico as opposed to
¿Es una
Germanic
utopía
countries?
o será la
Is it
vocacionalización de la
a
enseñanza?
utopia, or is it the vocationalization
no
of
existe en español, es la
of
traducción literal de
the
vocación-
training? It's the vocationalization, so to say.
Voy a explicar luego estos
This is not
conceptos, me van
a word
servir
that we
para-
can have in
para
Spanish,
armar
but
el
I have
argumento
coined the word
final.
from English.
La educación dual
The
no comenzó
dual
en,
training
con la llegada de los
did not
alemanes
start with the Germans
a México.
when they arrived in
El
Mexico.
convenio que hizo el CONALEP del Estado de México,
The CONALEP
que distingo con Mercedes-Benz. Desde
had an agreement with
1978,
Mercedes-Benz
bajo la influencia del Banco Mundial,
from
con una presión muy fuerte al
1978
gobierno
with the
mexicano,
influence
pero
of
también
the World
con
Bank, with a
recursos,
pressure
con préstamos
to
blandos,
the
se
Mexican
instituyó el
government,
Colegio Nacional
the
de
National
Formación
School for
Profesional.
Vocational Training was established.
Y es la primera vez que entró
And this
la
was the first
educación
time that we
profesional.
had
Antes
professional
hablábamos de
education.
educación vocacional
Before that, we spoke about
educación
vocational training,
o tecnológica.
technical training,
Ese
or
es lo
technological
mismo, pero
training.
son los diferentes nombres, dependía de quién fuera el presidente.
It was all the same actually, but the name
corriente
changed depending on the
ideológica
type of president that we had. and the ideas of the government that we had. The agreement was signed in 2009. It was between Mercedes-Benz and the government to prepare CONALEP students. CONALEP was an institution that offered studies that was 3 years after basic education, and they could not move to higher studies because they said it was ultimate, because they could not go any further than that.
Entonces se crea el CONALEP. Y fue la primera institución
CONALEP was then built, and it was the first institution to incorporate the model of basic training. After the agreement with Mercedes, that was very peculiar, an institution, a factory to prepare workers in the assembly line of Mercedes-Benz, and including all the things that were required in the cars. So new agreements were signed, and it was not because the Secretary of Education was looking for an intervention, but rather it was the COMEXA, the Chamber for Commerce and Industry in Germany. They wanted to have an influence so that the dual education was institutionalized and there would be more agreements. This is a quick graphic on how the situation of education is in Mexico. When it says professional technical training for baccalaureate here on the right, this is part of what I call bureaucratization. We're talking about more than 20 different institutions with different rules. Each one has its own rules.
Déjenme platicarles que la educación técnica moderna en México.
Technical modern education was started in Mexico in the 30s. After 1920, we had the first institutions to prepare labor force. They were providing manpower for the industry because it was necessary. There were no technicians in Mexico. Even, for instance, people who were driving the trains, they had to be imported from the US because there were no Mexicans that knew how to drive a train. The people that were actually there after the Pancho Villa revolution, they were killed in the war. So they had to import them. So the pre-vocational schools that were there were situated in that place. They were created in the Porfirio times. There were engineering schools, etc. Mining as well. Accounting, architecture, etc. But it was a very, very small elite they were for, and the same for teachers. There were not many teachers. So the first technical one in the 20th century was the one for mechanical and electric engineering, and then the construction university. That was then called School of Engineering and Architecture of the Polytechnic Institute. That was 1938 by Lázaro Cárdenas during the times of the socialist education. This was an initiative not of the government, not of the revolutionary group that had the power. but also teachers that have experienced and experimented with this topic. John Dewey visited Mexico. One of his students was Mexican, and Dewey said that many Mexicans, even though they could not read or write, they didn't read English, but they knew about him. They could actually understand the pragmatic education, the active education that was advocated for by Dewey. Then, socialist education was fascinated by the Russian Revolution. They admired Bolshevists. But the leading power, Calles, was the maximum leader of the revolution.
Cuando fue presidente, era admiraban, bueno,
they
no,
admired,
sino
not only admired, but rather was fascinated with the corporativism of Mussolini. They were thrilled by fascism because they wanted to do something similar, and this was very successful. The corporative system in Mexico was very efficient and it worked quite well. They placed everybody in their own place. Workers in the Confederation of Workers, the workers were there. Peasants in the National Central Peasant Organization. Traders in the Chamber of Commerce. Bankers in the association, etc. Everybody except for the teachers. There was no trade union for teachers. David Rabi carried out a research on this, and he said that there were many organizations that did not want to have a trade union because they rightly perceived that they would be colonized, because who chose the leaders of these organizations of workers, peasants and traders were not the members of the association, but the president. Socialist education was a temporary government in Mexico. Secular education succeeded religious one, and there were fights between liberals and conservatives, conservative people that had to do with the grassroots movement of peasants and other movements. In 1917, when this constitution was signed, there were 81 words. There are more than 3,000 words now. The concept was that there would be an end of secularity, because the school would arrange the activities so that in the youth, a concept can be created that is rational on social life. This was based on the clash of classes in scientific truth, material production. There had to be a superstructure that had to respond to that, and against fanaticism. At least this is what they said. Reformers said that. The scientific truth of the universe was predominant. So it is then when we see the basic institutions, such as the Polytechnic Institute with vocational schools and pre-vocational ones that were not integrated in the Polytechnic, but rather were administrated by the public administration. This was a slow development, and in 1976 Echeverría says that all these structures were removed and new institutions were developed. It was technological training. And there were many institutions. In 6 years, from 280, we moved to more than 1,000. The number of fees paid was 3 times more, and it was not technical education anymore, it was technical and industrial, commercial, fisheries, etc. And each of the different general directions within the Secretariat had their own rules, and they all survived. The names have changed. The names are different now, but they are all the same today.
Esta es el panorama. Aquí tenemos educación tecnológica.
This is the situation that we have now. We have industrial training, centers for high school, agricultural centers. There are 22 different institutions, each one with the rules. All of them are included in the technological and professional baccalaureate.
Los promotores, la Comexa, la Coparmex, que es la
Comexa y Coparmex, the Confederation of Entrepreneurs, are all entrepreneurs, and they want to promote, to mainly promote the dual education, and they are doing it because they talk to the government, have round tables, and just as in Finland, they were missions not only of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, but also from other cooperation agencies, such as the one that promoted the dual education model.
¿Y qué es lo que tenemos aquí?
So what do we have here?
Que esta educación dual, pero también la educación
dual
técnica,
education, but also technical education, in spite of the socialist rhetoric and the clash of classes,
dormía bajo la sombra de la teoría del capital humano.
It was actually sleeping behind this shadow of the human capital. If one reads the speeches of the civil servants during the socialist times, it was the same. Competent workforce, workers for the industry, enhancing productivity, improving production, and the difference between that socialist education and the new technical education or technological education is that they spoke about the distribution of riches and wealth, and they wanted to change the world. They were dreaming about education being able to change the world. In a way, with dual education, they were thinking or dreaming about the same thing. We were saying that in Switzerland we see that the Protestant ethics believe that they have the invisible hand in the market. They make it visible, though. So it is more or less the dream, but in the socialist times it was the clash of classes, the relationship with the Russian Revolution, etc. The teachers during the socialist revolution, they were not conceived as teachers,
sino como agitadores, como organizadores sociales cuya misión no era nada más enseñar en las escuelas a leer, escribir, a contar a los alumnos, sino prepararlos para la lucha de clases que estén en contra de la explotación del capitalismo y para establecer el socialismo que vendrá en el futuro. Pero dentro del
and for the socialism that would eventually come in the future. This was more rhetorical than anything else.
No era tanto retórica, pero el término ahí,
the socialist one was not so much of a rhetoric, but it was more rhetorical than practical.
En los 90, ya
in the 1990s,
la teoría del capital humano entra de
when
lleno,
the theory of human capital starts, in 1978, the idea was to train, as part of the mission, the government that signed the human capital to enhance the productivity of the country, the international competition, etc.
Y sigue ahí.
And this still remains.
Bien. La transferencia del modelo
The
de
transfer of the
educación dual.
dual education model.
En
In
1993,
1993, the
ya lo
first
platicamos, fue en el
agreement
CONALEP
was
y la
signed
Mercedes-Benz,
between the CONALEP and
que preparó
Mercedes-Benz
720
that
trabajadores,
prepared
y todos esos
720
720
workers, and
estudiantes se
all of
convirtieron
them
en trabajadores de la
became
Mercedes-Benz,
workers of
no
Mercedes-Benz,
en trabajadores de línea, calificados,
line
eran
workers.
competentes,
They were
tenían
qualified,
salario, y algunos
they
todavía
were
son
competent, they had a
veteranos ahí.
salary, and some of
En
them were there.
2011, el gobierno
In
local del Estado de
2011,
México, no el gobierno
the
federal,
local
el
government
gobierno
of the
nacional,
state of
firmó
Mexico,
una
not the
carta de
federal one,
intención con la Fundación
signed a letter of
de
intent
Alemania para
with
promover la educación
the
dual.
Stenbeis
Ya no era una
Foundation in
empresa,
Germany to
sino una
promote
fundación que
dual
venía a
vocational training.
promoverlo.
It was a
Y en
foundation.
octubre de 2013,
And in
la
October
CEP anunció por
2013,
primera
the
vez
CEP
una fase
announced for
piloto
the first time
nacional
a
para
pilot
que la CEP es la Secretaría de
stage.
Educación Pública, el Ministerio de
The
Educación,
CEP is
y
the
la Confederación Patronal
Ministry
de
of
la República
Education
Mexicana
and the
y
Confederation of the
trabajaría en
Confederation of
conjunto con la Cámara
Entrepreneurs, together
Mexicana
with
y
the
Alemana
Chamber
de
of
la Industria
Commerce
y el Comercio, la
and the
CAMEC,
joint Mexican and
para
German
iniciar el
Chamber of
modelo
Commerce.
mexicano
They
de
started
formación
the
profesional
Mexican
dual. Y le
model
pusieron
of
las iniciales
dual
M,
vocational training. And the acronym
F,
was
P,
MNFP.
La CAMEXA anuncia con
CAMEXA
mucha claridad y su orgullo
announces
y la
very
lógica en
clearly
su página web qué es lo que
and
espera de la
proudly
educación dual, cuáles
what
son
they
los
expect
resultados
of
que
dual
esperan.
education,
Es
what
la
are the results that they are
de la
expecting.
educación dual.
It is the promise
Pero
of
fíjense
dual
muy bien, por
education,
favor,
but
contar con personal calificado
you can
acorde con
count
las necesidades
with
de la empresa.
professionals that are
Ahorrar en
trained
costos y
according to the needs of the
reclutamiento,
company. We can
disminuir la
save in
rotación de
costs
personal,
and
reducir el
recruitment,
riesgo de
decrease
emplear a personas que no tienen
the
las
risk of
competencias
having people that are
adecuadas,
not
contar con
adequately trained,
trabajadores motivados
having
y
motivated
leales,
workers that are
tal vez
loyal.
dóciles, aunque no lo pongan por escrito, pero
Even
estaban pensando ahí que eran disciplinados, dóciles, que siguen
Even
las reglas
if
ahí.
it doesn't say anything
Aumentar
about
la
that, they were
productividad y la
supposedly easy to
calidad de
manipulate.
los productos y
The
procesos.
enhancement of the quality of the products,
Pero no hablan
etc.
nada del
But
bienestar
they
de
never
los
speak about the
trabajadores.
welfare of the workers.
Esto está tomado textual de la página web.
This is
Entonces,
taken as
les
such
interesa el
from the
bienestar de la
webpage.
empresa, aligerar los
So they are
problemas que
interested
tienen,
in
sobre
the
todo las empresas
welfare
alemanas.
of
Hay
the
convenios
company.
ya no solamente con la
There are
Mercedes-Benz,
agreements not
sino
only with
con Audi, con
Mercedes-Benz, with
Volkswagen,
Audi,
con otras más. En
Volkswagen,
el paper
etc.
ahí están las.
You can see it in the paper.
Entonces tenemos esta cuestión. Ha salido
So we have this
doblado
question. Well, apparently
Créanme,
this
por
is
favor, que hice todo lo
wrong.
posible y lo puse,
I did my best.
lo enderecé, pero este es el
I
modelo
corrected
ideal.
it, but this is the
Según
ideal
los
model.
promotores,
According to the
Si
promoters,
pueden leer, si
if
pueden
you can read,
acostarse tantito así
and
para
you can
leer.
do something
No,
like this to be able to read it, can
Yo-
you do it? It's a bit
Cuando yo lo
difficult, I
mandé
know.
estaba
When I sent it, it was
correcto,
okay. I
pero-
don't know why
Bueno,
it's wrong now. Well,
Este es el
anyway,
modelo ideal.
this is the ideal
Si todas
model.
las cosas
If
funcionan
all the
bien
things
y
work
estos
correctly
actores,
and these actors
y agentes
and agents
trabajan
work
En armonía,
in harmony,
se van a cumplir
then
los propósitos
the
de la educación, de la
purposes
formación
of
profesional
training
dual.
and vocational training
Van
will
a
be
lograr
achieved.
más competencia,
We will
va a
achieve
haber
a better degree of competence.
La ciencia, el gobierno, todo va a estar
Science, the
organizado
government, everything will be
coherentemente, o sea,
organized,
con un espíritu
well arranged,
teutónico,
with
claro,
a German
conciso,
spirit,
eficaz.
clear, concise,
Ese es
efficient.
el modelo ideal.
This is the
Pero
ideal model.
Matías, que no
Matías,
vino,
who
y
didn't
Cristina
come,
Wiman,
and Christina
que
Wiman,
colabora.
that
Bueno, el artículo principal,
also works in
la-
this paper.
La primera autora es Cristina Wiman. y Matías
Christina
Fritz
is actually number one
identifican
author of
estos,
this article, of
problemas.
this paper, and they identify these
Primero,
problems.
existen oportunidades. de
There are
acuerdo, está muy
first
bien, este
opportunities.
modelo ideal,
This
ahí.
is very well.
Pero que
This
la
is the
formación
ideal
profesional
model,
formal
and
se considera
formal,
de calidad inadecuada.
professional
Y no están diciendo ahí,
or vocational
profesores
training
que
is
tengan muchas
inadequate for
calificaciones.
discipline mechanics in some
No
other
es lo
place.
mismo el egresado del
It is not
CONALEP
the
en
same
Aguascalientes que
in
hace
coming
prácticas
from
en la
a
Nissan
Aguascalientes, where you do an apprenticeship in Nissan, where the biggest manufacturing plant of Nissan outside Japan is located, as it is in Sonora, where there's no manufacturing plant. And the implementation is a challenge, partly because even if the CONALEP was born with great expectations that it would have some 400,000 students in 10 years and was going to be the most dynamic part of education in Mexico, the facilities became old, the equipment is not that updated, and especially in the last few years, the resources available are being brought down. It is being referred to by our president as austerity or Franciscan poverty, when the president wants to use that term.
La subsecretaria de Educación Media Superior,
the Deputy Secretary for Higher Education, who's the chairperson of the President for the Mexican model for dual training, spoke very proudly. Her name is Nora Rubalcaba Gámez, and her presentation took place, was delivered in October, spoke that during the period 2018-2019 period, there were some
2,609 estudiantes. De 2,609 estudiantes
2,600 students from in 2018. It went up in 2022 to 10,544. It was a 300% jump in a population that, if you add all that up, the part below with the 51,000 with 1,775,000, almost a million.
Nada más 10,000 están inscritos.
Students, only 10,000 are registered, formally registered in dual education. So in percentage terms, the growth is incredible, but in terms of registration numbers, is ridiculous, it's very small.
Y luego, la insatisfacción de los trabajadores,
another thing is the lack of satisfaction of students. They were promised that the salaries at those public institutions were be raised up to the vocational trainers at the National Polytechnic Institute. So the session, the conference in the Congress, the Mexican Congress, was stopped, and they are speaking about a strike. And also there's great insatisfaction because the benefits are not the elegant ones. In Mexico, people are very much usually hired on a per-hour basis. For example, you're an engineer and I'm going to hire you for 5 hours a week, and you will not get any benefits or public insurance or gather seniority, and someone who's an engineer working pretty well at the Mercedes-Benz do that just out of personal will. So whatever the CONALEP pays them is not relevant considering what they get as a salary. But it's not the same for those who do not count on this type of job.
En esta misma charla del 8 de octubre, la subsecretaria le dio la bienvenida
October the 8th, the Deputy Secretary welcomed the representative of the Swiss Chamber, and you may see how increasing productivity, raising the salaries, and they do not consider the students as future workers, but rather as resources to achieve their aims.
The
project does not refer to humanism, not even to physical education, just to work, and companies want to include what should be taught at their curriculum. And of course, following the OECD, great emphasis is placing on STEM. But what about ethics and community education? There's no reference to that, to a wholesome and comprehensive training of the person.
¿Cómo interpretarlo?
How can you interpret this offer, this transition that the German cooperation agencies and companies do to Mexico? In compare education, there are different approaches, but there are some three which are more widely published there. The theory of world culture, its father is John Mayer. It was born in Stanford, and it tells us that it's a global trend. It's part of the logical development and progression of humanity. There's a kind of a cultural isomorphism, because all educational institutions look to each other, and when there's something which is not that similar, it's because it suffers from is not very ideally coupled, and they say that, for example, it's because of the action of some trade unions, etc. So there's the theory that all of this is logical and legitimate, and then we would have the proposal, and I can follow the text by my mentor, and
Él documenta cómo las potencias europeas colonizaron
he documents how the European powers colonized Africa, Latin America, some countries in Latin America,
organizaron sistemas educativos
a
imagen y semejanza de los
educational systems
de los países centrales,
inspired in the Central European countries,
metieran a la gente a estudiar y pensaran como lo pensaban los de los países centrales,
think the way that Central European countries thought, but in a subordinate fashion. That's when we refer to imperial colonialism. Neo-imperialism is referred to as that, things are not so much done by force, and that's why the DAC, the JICA from Japan, foreign agencies work, but more than anything else, the UNESCO, the OECD, the World Bank, there's intellectual work behind, they do research, they look for best practices and say how they should be replicated in other places, and they try and convince governments. Well, I feel uncomfortable with those approaches, is that they do not see the dominant groups in their countries not as political agents, as they should only act as a transmission belt. So all these political theory, the borrowing and lending, for me is more convincing because it analyzes the national idiosyncrasy of the destination country of the educational transfer of these ideas, as the local groups, dominant groups, and what they think are good for our own aims. And of course they should do concessions, and are the ones who face, which face the problems. For example, when there's a certain opposition, for example, teachers, trade unions, and the two initial theories are not taken into account at all. That's part of the explanation. But I will go rather for this third explanation. The paper, I deal a little bit more in depth with that. But let's enter into the answer to these two questions I asked.
Y esto tiene que ver también
And this has got to do, it's not in the paper, but with that I referred to about the professional school of Mondragón, the combination of studies and productive work. I dealt in depth with these ideas that were put to practice by Karl Marx and Engels and John Dewey.
Para Marx y Engels, la educación
For Marx and Engels, education
debería combinar la educación con el trabajo productivo y tendría
productive
que ser
work with basic education and should be oriented in three directions.
Tenía que ser mente,
it should cover the mind,
espíritu,
the soul,
mente, espíritu y físico.
And the physical body. For example, physical education, like in military schools, and that children should work productively in order to implement this type of education. And he mentions how Owens, in the cooperatives he started in England, he implemented these things, and then that entered the legislation on labor in different countries, and how these tended to the training of a
hay un problema que en la formación de esta persona plena, Marx y Engels no tomaban en cuenta para nada
Marx and Engels did not take into account the role of
trabajo
culture or art.
Enseñanza física.
They just dealt with productive work, intellectual training, and physical education, and that would be all. And John Dewey goes beyond that.
Que proponía, y también era la triada de mente, cuerpo y espíritu.
Proposed a kind of triad
para la formación
mind, body, and
hombre.
soul.
Y ahora diríamos el hombre y la mujer
for the training of men. Now we would say
el principio de Dewey no era que se formara al ciudadano
cosmopolitan men and women.
Ciudadano de un país, sino ciudadano del mundo. Era la humanidad era el centro de las cosas.
Humanity
y sí, combinar el estudio con trabajo productivo, pero no para beneficio del capitalismo, sino como traer la experiencia de la escuela, del trabajo a la escuela, porque solo vía la experiencia y también la experiencia en el arte puede formar a esta persona. Eran las ideas. Esta es la edutopía. Y digo edutopía en
edutopia,
positivo, el término lo agarré
posing it in the positive
sense.
I take it from Norton Grubb and Marvin Laserson. They tried to show what was happening in Korea and other places in terms of the vocationalization of teaching. And they refer then to that gospel of the improvement of the productivity of companies. And they also speak about how the OECD introduces a series of notions and speaks about equality, integration, also for women and girls. And this is a trend around which humanism and social sciences do not play any significant role.
El cierre 1.
So, conclusion number one,
voy a leer porque
closing remark.
Está larguita la cita, bueno, no tanto, porque los colegas que no hablan español no lo pueden leer. Digo, sí lo pueden
colleagues
leer, pero no lo entienden,
who do not read Spanish maybe won't be able to follow. So, if you think of Mexican education from the 30s of the 20th century up to the present time, to perceive how the schooling tradition is experienced. And dual education explained why in Mexico it was going to suffer from many problems. In Germany, it's successful from that for that tradition of those workshops
y que hay esa tradición de que los
which
obreros
were
son obreros y
turned
la clase obrera
into
tiene sus escuelas y tienen
the modern schools for workers,
y que le dan mucha importancia al trabajo práctico. En cambio,
to the fact
la
that practical work is attributed a big weight. But the French influence, which is the one we perceive better, is the one promoting school education, that mathematics and sciences would dominate teaching, and humanities would play a secondary role. It is true that at some technical schools there are good labs and practical sessions take place there, but according to Dewey, to John Dewey, not all activities can be considered to be as an experience. People do not assimilate. Students will not apprehend. What has that got to do with work when they fulfill a task without getting involved in terms of their imagination or feelings? Is like reading on water. There's nothing which turns that activity into an experience in the living sense of the term. And that would mean turning this cosmopolitan citizen in a fully developed person who can act in society and love him or herself, and also love not just their neighbors, but also the whole of mankind. Closing remark number 2. With all the limitations I pointed out, dual vocational training and before at the CONALEP, but with the tools provided by the German-speaking cooperation agencies, come as a new wind in the Mexican educational system. The promoters of dual vocational training, the GIZ and BIBB, and the World Bank have powerful arguments, but the deployment in Mexico was slow and controversial because it's not that attractive for youngsters who prefer traditional teaching, and the red tape is difficult for them to decodify. These young people enter the secondary education, but they do not get into dual education because it takes them time away. Going to the factories means an investment of time for them. They want to become engineers, architects, etc., with the exception of poor people who really need to get a job as soon as possible. Or in some cases, such as in the case of the CONALEP at the airport, they know that they will have a well-paid job because they are the ones taking care of the planes, checking the planes, etc., or in some factories, in car-producing plants.
Sí, pienso yo que tiene ciertas ventajas, pero al final del cuentas el modelo mexicano de formación dual todavía anima la teoría del capital humano y está más cerca del evangelio de la vocación y de la enseñanza que de una utopía.
Traditional teaching than of a utopia.
Y esta es mi propia dualidad.
And that would be my own duality, not just tigers but also kangaroos.
Un momento, por favor, Carlos.
Just a minute, Carlos. There's some cognac here. There's not much left. It's 45 minutes as he taught me to do, as he instructed me to do. It's a bit cold. I will treat you to a glass of cognac. Even if I know that you brought your scarf.
que sería trágico que el profesor Ornelas cogiera el avión y regresara a México con lo que nosotros llamamos constipado, resfriado, y que después, se los he dicho a ella para que me entere, este señor tiene columnas en el Excelsior, no en cualquier sitio, y que diga que va a España de forma irónica. Yo he leído artículos, columnas de él. Vamos, de una gran elocuencia en la Facultad de Ciencia de la Educación, que estaría en su derecho de decirlo. No sé, aquí tenéis esto, yo no sé, para encenderlo tendría que venir detrás, y se enciende independientemente. No voy a hablar de este asunto, no voy a hablar de este asunto, porque es patético. Y yo he terminado diciéndole, no, después es para ahorrarle a la Junta de Andalucía unos cuantos euros.
They told me that they had to save
esto
a
es
few euros to the
patético,
original government, so this is just pathetic. The thing that they are not switching on.
Y no hablo más, podría dedicarme mis últimos años de mi vida a escribir mis memorias de este tipo. Por favor, Carlos, sé que te gusta. Este es un brandy español, de Jerez, que yo lo tengo guardado porque fui al bar, me dijeron, don Miguel, es que aquí está prohibido vender alcohol. Digo, entonces recordé, digo, sí, ya sé que tengo yo uno. Es irónico, pero para mí es muy triste. Bueno, la ponencia... Sí, gracias, Carlos. La ponencia es realmente elocuente. Sí la leemos toda, está muy bien escrita y realmente a mí me confirma cosas que voy a seguir investigando, de donde España coge el modelo de la dual. Pero ya digo, como historiador tengo que comprobarlo, porque yo tengo artículos periodísticos, lo que pasa que cuando no sé seguirlo, pero voy a descubrir. Porque da la impresión de que aquí sale un ministro, pone la dual y tal, y vamos, que esto no conviene habablarlo porque no está confirmado, y simplemente digo que si hay una visita del señor Ver a México, estuvo en México, pero yo no me acuerdo cómo se desarrolló esa visita y el contenido de ese artículo, pero lo que sí está claro es que México abandera con una tradición determinada la educación dual, lo que se llama educación dual, y eso es lo que hay que, desde el campo de la investigación científica, del mundo académico, que ponerlo en evidencia. Bien, ¿algún comentario para ya clausurar? Y los traductores que están haciendo maravillosamente bien su trabajo terminan.
Muchas gracias por el brandy.
Well, thanks very much for the cognac.
Yo lo platiqué con alguien y yo creo que Miguel lo intuyó. Es viernes a las 6 de la tarde.
It's a Friday. It's
esas las horas que
6 p.m. That's the time when I start getting drunk
pues toda la
in Mexico.
Te queda lo que queda. No te preocupes que compro otra.
The rest of the bottle if you want.
No tengo miedo a las críticas.
I'm open to criticism.
No hay ninguna pregunta. Entonces vamos a dar por concluido el simposio sobre los retos y desafíos de la reforma de la formación profesional en España a partir del modelo dual. Y el subtítulo ya lo conocéis. Y nada. Hay que seguir trabajando, hay que seguir leyendo, hay que seguir debatiendo, y aquí estamos, sencillamente. Muchas gracias.
So thanks very much for attending this seminar.
No, ok. Muy bien.
Una felicitación a Miguel por lo
I would
que a su
like
equipo
just
por
to
organizar
congratulate
este
Miguel
simposio.
and his team for making the effort to organize this symposium.
Gracias.
So we've finished the session.